Boss Man, right?
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is OutKasted Conversations, Season 2. What episode we on? 9?
I don't know.
9 sounds right. 9 sounds right. And my guest today is, again, one of the homies, one of the really good scholars, Dr. Clint Fluker. I'm not going to mess up your title. Tell the people what your title is.
Again, my name is Clint Fluker. I'm the Assistant Director of Engagement and Scholarship at the Atlanta University Center Robert W. Woodruff Library.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, I got it all out. You saw that?
Put it all. I mean, that's a long-ass business card, though, too. It's like,
it certainly is.
Then turn it on the back. We gonna keep going. So, all right, you know what you got to do to get into the club. How did you become outcasted?
All right, then. So I like to kind of tell people this to start it out. Mm-hmm. My mom's side of the family is all from Atlanta.
Oh, okay.
But I started out growing up in the beginning in Nashville, Tennessee, and Rochester, New York. Oh. So we didn't move back to Atlanta, or my mom didn't move back to Atlanta with the family until I was like 12, 13. And I don't know what was in my CD case. I imagine it was a combination of like Green Day, like that kind of stuff. So I was walking around Atlanta with this. And I went into, I think it was like 7th grade. That's when I came back. And one of the 8th graders, he saw what I was listening to. He's just like, oh, let me take a look. Let me see what you got.
Oh, boy.
And, he's like flipping through, and he got that real disappointed face on him. I'm new. I'm trying to
It's not looking good for you.
No, it's not looking good. And he was like, you ain't got no cast? I was like, what are you even talking about? And he was like, you don't have any OutKast here. And so he immediately put me on to Equimini. He put me on to AT Aliens. He just became a good friend in that sense throughout the rest of my time. No, he really did. Mm-hmm, he really did. Mm-hmm. And it put me on to how I could be part of the culture in Atlanta that was already in my lineage and I didn't know. So there you go. That's how I became a fan. And it really did start with Equimini. So that's my favorite album. I can't lie.
Okay. All right.
Got to go right to it. But yeah, that's how I was introduced.
Green Day, bro.
I'm pretty sure that's what it was. I can't lie.
But
Rochester, Pittsford, New York is a wild place.
I mean, listen. I don't have anything against Green Day. I had a couple Green Day CDs. You know what I'm saying? But it's like, I'm just laughing because I don't think that like kids today understand the wealth of the CD book. It was like, you didn't bring your book, like you didn't bring your whole book with you to school because if somebody stole your music, it was on. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I still have grudges with some of my cousins who stole some of my albums. Like my Drew Hill album, You know what I'm saying? Erica, where my Drew Hill album at, Erica? Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but
now once I got my CD case together.
You got it together?
Yeah, once I got it all together, now my brother started stealing that stuff. But I'd already stolen it all from my older cousin, my big brother. So, so it just goes down.
Stolen music continues.
Yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah, so I mean, you do a lot of really dope things. But one of your research areas that's particularly interesting is that you study Afrofuturism.
That's right.
For the folks who are uninitiated, what is Afrofuturism?
So I think it depends on who you're talking to. Okay. So I'll kind of, run you through a little bit of it and then like where I land. So if you're talking to some groups, I think that in the general public, like when we hear the term Afrofuturism, usually what people are referring to is just Black speculative fiction writ large. It's become like an umbrella term for Black science fiction, fantasy, things like that. That's the way it's used popular. With another group of people, I think it's become something that's a little bit more critical, that deals specifically with science fiction and the language of science fiction. And so we see a lot of like sci-fi iconology, what's the term I'm looking for? Iconography. Thank you very much. We see a lot of that. But really what I'm interested in is not just Afrofuturism that goes like 1,000 years into the future. I love that stuff, don't get me wrong. I got a whole PhD studying just that.
Right.
But I think that what I'm really interested in is how do we use the metaphors, how do we use the language of science fiction to think critically about the present day and where we will be 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, 50 years in the future. So what I think Afrofuturism does best, and there's a lot of great definitions from people like Alondra Nelson, Kojo Oshun, Greg Tate, Ronaldo Anderson with Afrofuturism 2.0, people who have done some great critical thinking about this, it is a tool that we use to interrupt mainstream narratives about where Black people will be in the future.
I really like that language in terms of, it's used to disrupt what folks think that we can and what we will do. OutKast does that a lot, especially on ATLians. Like the whole album is Afrofuturistic, right? From the use of spaceship sounds to the comic book and they're fighting and all of these things. Can you kind of walk us through how Afrofuturism can help us understand the significance of that album?
So I think that Scott Heath does a really good job with this in his essay on the planetary South, I think he calls it. Yeah. And there was a great symposium, which I could not attend, that was Jackson State University called Planet Deep South.
It was dope. I was there.
That's what I hear. Everybody else was there, and I wasn't there.
It was like homecoming in February. It was homecoming in February.
Yeah, that's what I hear. But that whole crew, we in the AUC now, so we're gonna do it again. So get ready in 2019.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, all right. But I think that what Scott does really well with the idea of the planetary South is he thinks about artists, musicians like OutKast. He also goes into other rappers like Lil Wayne and the like, people who might use science fiction language in their work. And he says that really what they're doing is they are reorganizing or rethinking like the directions of like north, east, south, west. And how when you're, in the South or in the North, basically everything is about due north. Like, where's true north? And from north is where you can deduce where you are. Like, you're looking for the North Star, whatever. So now I know where east is, I know where west is, I know where south is. In that context, everything is derivative of the north. And you are looking at the South, and stereotypically, the South becomes the opposite of whatever is north. So historically, he goes into a great argument about how, like in the past, when enslaved people were trying to get out of the South, they were getting out of the South to go to the North because that's where, quote unquote, freedom was. Now, what we get from that is this historical backdrop of just sort of this history of looking at the South as backwards or antiquated and the like. So by putting your narrative, your new narrative, like as an AT-alien or as like we're coming from Stankonia, by putting yourself into space, the directions that were there on the land no longer matter.
Right.
And suddenly you can have a new narrative that, again, counteracts the mainstream narrative about what it is to be from the South, what it is to be from one of these southern states, or what it is like to be from Atlanta specifically. And I think OutKast does that in an amazing way. And they also participate in a lineage of people that do this as musicians generally. So it fits into this conversation about Afrofuturism when you go back to people like Sun Ra, who said that he was from Saturn. Or you go back to George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic. You can do the same thing if you skip over OutKast and you go to someone like Janelle Monáe.
Right.
And you think about Wonderland. They use very similar language about where they're from, coming from the future. And I just think that that's what OutKast has really landed us with when we think about the directions and what the South means to us.
I mean, because like immediately when I think Afrofuturism and OutKast, I automatically go to the Elevators video. I mean, the video was brilliant, right? On the one hand, you're pulling from like Predator, you know what I'm saying? And you have like them putting their handprints and only the folks in the hazmat suits can see it. And then ultimately, like, like you said, the promised land, usually, especially when you think about Southern folks, like you said, the promised land is north till you get there. And you're like, oh, hell no, this is, where's the promise? This is the land, where's the promise? But the promised land for them was returning to Africa, the continent, not the country, right? And you have the folks who are basically, they see their true selves. You see the pyramids. You see kind of like this very Afrocentric idea. And then you also look at, the cover art. Like they're in there, Atlanta becomes Atlantis. Atlantis is in space. Right? So, I mean, like, can you kind of talk about why that's significant for, Southern Black folks, particularly contemporary Southern Black folks? Because on the one hand, they're speaking to this world building that they're doing, which, Southern Black folks have built worlds for centuries. But the flip side of that is they're like subverting or turning on its ear what that promised land looks like in the immediate aftermath of being rejected by mainstream hip hop. So, any ideas?
Yeah, I think that when we think about the African diaspora and we think about Africa, this is really important with OutKast because we can put it in conversation with things that were happening at the same time in Atlanta. So I think about, from an archival perspective, at the AUC, we have the Asa Hilliard papers, for example. Asa Hilliard was a great educator. He spoke a lot about how we have to reach students early when we're talking about our legacy, when we talk about history, and we have to let them know that the Wakandas of the world are not just things that happen in fiction, that they're things that happen in real life. And one way of doing that is to create narratives like OutKast has done, where you are incorporating that kind of imagery and that kind of language into your work so that people start pointing their attention to Africa again, and recognizing that there are places like Atlanta where Africans came here by force, but they are here and they have created this wonderful beautiful tradition of entrepreneurship in Atlanta, of politics in Atlanta, and ultimately of things like hip hop in Atlanta as well, of culture, of arts. And it's something that we invented. It wasn't something that just came out of nowhere.
And it's complicated.
And it's very complicated. But to pull it back to Asa Hilliard real quick, what he did in order to make that narrative clear to young people was he led trips of educators to Egypt and to Liberia, so they could learn the history of what Black people had done. And if you can see what you've done historically, you can then begin to see what you could do in the future. And I think that that's where, again, OutKast comes into play. If you can see these stories being told, these interrupted narratives, you can hear it, you can see it, then you can begin to see how you could do it yourself in the future. Again, 5, 10, 15 years, not just 1,000 years.
Right, and for the record, there's definitely an understanding that OutKast wasn't the only, Southern hip hop folks do it. I mean, like 8 Ball and MJG immediately come to mind with Space Age Pimpin'. You know what I'm saying? So, but I still think that it's a really important conversation to have, is the role that Afrofuturism plays in how we articulate the complexities of what Southern hip hop is and what it can do. So you've written an essay for the OutKast reader that we're trying to finish. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the essay and how that idea of the, you guys talk about like the Afrofuturist Sun Belt, what that black belt, what does that mean and how is that useful for this kind of conversation?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying before about the lineage that OutKast that they participate in, going back to Sun Ra, going back to George Clinton, going back to these people. A lot of the kind of space conversation really comes from people that come from the South, whether it's in Alabama or the like. But in addition to that, what we do with the essay, me and Ronaldo Anderson, is we're trying to connect this whole story of the Dungeon family and bring it back to Afrofuturism. And particularly around the idea of the trap as well, because we kind of end by talking about future. And what a lot of people may have forgotten about outside of Atlanta, because everybody in Atlanta knows, is that Future actually comes from the Dungeon. He is the nephew, I think, of Rico Wade.
I thought he was his cousin.
Cousin. Yeah, he was cousin of Rico Wade. And it's just interesting. He said he used to hang out there when he was younger, like in the Dungeon, while they're cutting the tracks, while they're bringing in the music, while they're doing the whole thing. And he's learning the business from Rico and learning how to actually rap from everybody else that comes through there. And it's not just, like Big Boy and Andre. Of course, it's everybody else, CeeLo, Sleepy Brown. I mean, it's like name the people. And he gets to kind of see this happening right there. And he also Future talks about in different interviews and also in his music that, he comes from the trap, that his family were drug dealers. And he saw this as a place that he did not want to stay. And so he started telling stories. And by telling these stories, it was like he was rapping himself out of the trap. And you definitely see this tradition of storytelling coming from the Dungeon family. And the idea that in the midst of what could be seen as like, not just the trap, but I think in the art of storytelling, OutKast talks about the apocalypse.
Part 2.
Yeah, part 2. They talk about the apocalypse is coming, and what do they do in the midst of the apocalypse? They go directly to the dungeon. They want to just rap. They want to cut one last track, like superheroes coming out of there, being like, "We're going to save the world by telling this story."
Right.
Future does a really similar thing with his music, where he feels trapped in his own personal apocalypse. We want to tell these stories. So that's what we do with that essay, is try and bring a conversation out about the kind of music that's being produced, as well as the language. We go into depth into that, about the structure of these stories and how they can be used as liberation technologies in the context of Afrofuturism.
And I think that ultimately that's probably one of the biggest foundations of what Afrofuturism does for Black folks, is it gives us liberatory language. This is what it looks like to be free. What does it really mean for Black folks to be free? How do we get that? And we go to these worlds that we create, or even these apocalypses that we create. Thinking about like John Jennings and Stacey Robinson. It's not always nice and savvy. Sometimes you have to get to the grit.
As John calls it, the ethnogothic.
The ethnogothic.
Yeah. And
right.
I know you've done some work with him on that too.
A little
something.
But so with this framework that you and Ronaldo are giving us, which is brilliant, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
How can we use that to think about not necessarily just Future, but other contemporary Southern rap artists? Do you feel like there are Afrofuturist tendencies in their work? Do you feel like that's been kind of pushed to the side because the South is in a very different space than it was when ATLians and other Southern hip hop artists were playing around with this idea of futures?
I think it has influenced people a lot. Like I think about different rap artists like Migos, or there's so many rappers in Atlanta. I don't know what else to say.
Let the record show.
But I feel like this is something that that happens where we can, because someone has done it before, we want to do it again. So like we'll use things like, hey, I'm coming off of a spaceship, or as Future says, it's like, I'm the new Jimi Hendrix. It's like we do this, but there's something very specific, I think, about the work that Dungeon Family has done, and then I do see with groups like with Janelle Monáe and Wonderland, I see a particular kind of work happening where they're actually reading this material as they go along with it, or they're thinking about their own kind of universe in Atlanta, and like taking ownership of it as like a separate place, as a place where ATLians live. I think about this particularly when I was at OutKast at last. Did you go? I know.
Of course I went. All 3 days.
All 3 days? All right, so I went to the last one with like the Southern.
That was. I feel like Sunday was the best one.
Sunday was the best one.
Dirty South Roundup.
Yeah, the Dirty South Roundup. I mean, like everybody was there. I mean, it was like Kilo Ali came out, and I was just like, get out of here. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. But you had like a range of people who were on stage, but also in the crowd, like different ages, different races, everything. And this ties back into your question. I felt like we were in our own universe there, that was not necessarily started by OutKast, but certainly they became the center of that. And so in this little microcosm, this little universe of Atlanta, you were talking about liberation. When OutKast came out there, I was just like, this is one of the best moments I've ever had.
Me too.
I was there with my wife. We were there with friends that we just running into people from all over the place. And we're all connected through this kind of story of being different, of being people from Atlanta, being people from the South. And this was ours. And that in and of itself, tying into our identities, was liberating.
It was ours, and nobody's going to take that shit from us.
Yeah. And then, of course, Erica got out on the stage like, that's my baby daddy talking to me. I mean, like, it was... it was too much. It was too much. But, I mean, I think that it's influenced other rappers, other hip-hop artists. And I can be honest with you, like, that's not, like, my area of expertise is... but I think that... For me, it's what we've seen around the city and just like how we feel about the city. And in some cases, I don't know if everybody else feels that way. I just know we do, and it makes us feel great. It makes us feel free and that we can do anything because we connect this way.
No, I love it because I was thinking about Earth Gang, for example, and Young Thug have Afrofuturist tendencies, have tendencies.
Yeah.
But let me ask you this: what is OutKast's contribution to the conversation on Afrofuturism? What should we take away from that?
Can I tell you another story real quick? That I'll bring it
We
back.
are story friendly
I'll
at
bring it back.
OutKasted Conversations.
OutKast and the kind of universe that they've created here, or that they have centered in Atlanta, is so pervasive, so amazing that it reaches all kinds of people. I remember, and this was during the election, 2016. I won't say her name, but a family member of mine was going to the Busy Bee, and was just sort of hanging out. And she was, looking around, trying to get something to eat. And it was like around 1 o'clock, I think. And she saw sitting down 2 people. And she just got so excited. She was like, oh, I think that's Killer Mike. And she was like, oh, it's Killer Mike, yes. And this family member is like 70 years old. She was like, yo, that's Killer Mike. I can't believe this. When she tells you the story of meeting Killer Mike, she completely leaves out the fact that he was meeting with Bernie Sanders. The way she tells it is like, so Killer Mike was there, and it was awesome, and we had a little conversation. I took a little picture, and he was there with some little white man, and didn't know who he was. Hearing the story, because I knew that Bernie Sanders was in town, I was like, yeah, he's running for president. Like that's who he was with. And she's like, oh yeah, I know about him. What I'm saying is that what they have done is, it's so important to the city that it reaches not just like your 12-year-old who's just coming to Atlanta for the first time to live for real, and is just like, you can't even be introduced to the city without knowing OutKast, to like this 70-year-old woman who is just walking around trying to get something to eat, but she knows about the lineage of OutKast to the extent where she's like, yo, that's Killer Mike. That's my family right there. Let me say hello. I just think that that's an amazing thing that they can do through music. And when I think about Afrofuturism, to me, Afrofuturism is about the possibilities of, one, by bringing people together through this kind of family, creating these universes, these microcosms where we kind of work together, we think together, we have community, and then we build together to the future. That is a difficult task if you don't have a coalescing center. Something true, something real has to be at the center. And I think OutKast has helped us with that. One thing that I'm really interested in with Atlanta, generally, is about the development that's happening around the city. We have a lot of people coming from all over the country, New York, LA, Chicago, the like, and they might not be familiar with this legacy to the extent that we are. And I've noticed that in that context, there's been a reshaping of the lines of like how we think about Atlanta, and who is important and who's not. When we think about Atlanta now, there's a narrative about the future of Atlanta that is about this kind of, the city proper, like the downtown again. It's like, this is what Atlanta is, and we want to build around this and create all of these amenities and spaces and living. And that is a conversation for developers and politicians alike. But what I think OutKast has done, when you listen to their album, they're talking about the Atlanta that I grew up with, the Atlanta that my mom and dad grew up with, the Atlanta that my brothers and my cousins grew up with. And that is an Atlanta that is expansive. We all have ownership over this place. It's not just about being in the center. They talk about Decatur and they talk about the SWATs. We talk about being on the freeway. They talking about being in like these cookouts outside. It's like, this is who we are. And I think that we are losing some of that if we're not paying attention. And I'm reminded of that when I think about how important OutKast has been to like that bridge of like the 70-year-old onto the 18-year-old. So I just want to end it with that.
I think that's a great way to end it.
Cool.
Dr. Fluker, thebomb.com. Thank you so
appreciate
much
you.
for coming on the,
Mm-hmm.
doing it. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is OutKasted Conversations. We'll see y'all next time. Y'all be easy.
Appreciate you.